Hello, I'm Matt Lampert from the Socionomics Institute, joined by Robert Folsom from Elliott Wave International. Robert, thanks so much for taking some time to chat today.
Video greetings, Matt.
Absolutely. Now, Robert, two of the biggest stories in the financial markets this year have been the rise and dramatic fall in the price of GameStop stock, and also the dramatic rise in the prices in the cryptocurrency markets. And in each case, there's an unmistakable David versus Goliath motif that we've been reading about in commentary about these developments. In one case, you had a ragtag group of traders from Reddit going up against hedge funds and Wall Street. And in the case of cryptos, the David versus Goliath story may not be as obvious there, but you've got what could be really a challenge to the international monetary order. Is that too grand of a claim?
No, not at all. I think the David versus Goliath metaphor is a good one for our topic broadly. And just to keep the scale in mind, it's worth saying that whatever institution or social norm that we're talking about, Goliath represents the status quo, and it imposes its authority from the top down, but the Davids who challenge the status quo, defy authority, demand social change, that all springs from the bottom up, and that struggle is a story everybody can understand.
It's a classic story that we see over and over again throughout history. And one of the things that's interesting when we think about the maintaining of the status quo is that quite a lot of that maintenance ends up happening because folks are willing to go along with it. You know, the people are willing to run with the herd all the time, and if the herd's running in the direction that's favorable to the status quo, hey, that's good for the powers that be. But when social mood changes, you see the herd change direction, and sometimes no matter what the status quo does, no matter what the powers that be might want to try to do, that mood trend ends up winning out in the end. And so far in the cases we've seen these David versus Goliath struggles, but it seems to be the Goliaths notching the W's, at least so far. Fair to say?
I absolutely. You know, that clearly was the case with GameStop. The Goliath pushed back very hard and had a lot of support from other institutions, including the press and Wall Street unanimously. And you know, people who bought near the high of GameStop, they were left holding the bag, and the bag was empty.
Yes.
The cryptos have been somewhat of a different story, and you know, by now Bitcoin's been around over a decade, right? And they've run prices up to levels that are just hard to get your head around. And for the time being, they've prevailed, and that speaks to the longer future of cryptos. But for a long time, it was a David and Goliath story.
And if you think of it, I remember first reading about Bitcoin back in 2010 when Elliot Prechter wrote an essay about it in the Elliott Wave Theorist. And back then, Bitcoin was trading at 6 cents. And I was trying to wrap my head around what this thing even was. And my gosh, you look at the price appreciation, even this month, $1 invested in Bitcoin back then in September 2010 would have been worth close to $1 million this month. It's just been a meteoric rise in price. But you've got two prongs to this story. Yes, you have the increase in price. Part of that is, or a significant amount of that is the manic mood behind a financial mania that's attached itself to the crypto story. But you also have perhaps the bigger promise, or potential at least, of cryptos, and that is as a medium of exchange that's, in theory anyway, free from the influence and the machinations of governments and central banks.
Yeah, it's a direct challenge. And the Goliaths have understood that all along, and it's gotten so big that even the new Treasury Secretary has made accommodating remarks about it. She has expressed some caution, but that's the first recognition from a Goliath that was as public and obvious as her remarks were.
And in terms of a financial narrative about this kind of thing, it seems like we've heard something like this, if not this story exactly, back, say, in the 1970s with the rise in the precious metals.
Right. The late 70s saw two brothers from Texas, as I recall, try to corner the silver market, and they succeeded for a time, but it was very much of the period, and eventually it failed, but that was definitely from the bottom up, and it definitely challenged the status quo.
And you had an accommodating mood in that market, and the top of that silver rally happened in early 1980, and it ended with a dramatic short squeeze that you're describing in that market in silver. And by the end of that rally, you might recall the COMEX exchange took some rather drastic steps. They outlawed anything other than position closing. So you could close your positions but couldn't open new ones. And since the vast majority of traders were long, then they could sell, but they couldn't add to their position. And does that sound familiar? That's kind of like exactly what happened at the end of that GameStop rally, when we started to see some institutional forces step in, just as that was that trend was in the process of reversing.
Yeah, it's like if Goliath doesn't like the rules, he'll change the rules.
He'll change, and you've still got the mood in control there overall as well. There's no reason why prices had to collapse. My gosh, if they opened the market back up and the mood was still there, hey, you could have seen a bounce back, and we've seen a little bit of a bounce in GameStop stock, but certainly nothing back up to the level of the high from earlier this year. Well, Robert, let's pivot back to the future a little bit here, or I should say back to the past, because we were talking about this rally in the precious metals in the late 70s and in early 1980. But it strikes me that we also saw a series of challenges to the status quo in the decade of the 1960s, particularly the latter part of that decade into the 1970s, which was also a bear market in stocks.
Yeah, there are so many stories, David and Goliath stories, that begin in the mid 60s or so. So many things come to mind. On a grand social scale, the civil right and voting rights movement versus Jim Crow laws in the South, and eventually the long hot summers in the cities and the urban areas that followed. I think about how top-down urban planning was the model that city authorities and even federal authorities followed for years and years. And then came the movement for local community control. And that was best shown in the epic fight between Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs in New York. Robert Moses built the Triborough Bridge, the United Nations, and he was mostly the reason why the Brooklyn Dodgers left New York. He's the most powerful man most people have never heard of, far more powerful than any New York governor or mayor. And what he wanted to do was build a 10-lane superhighway across Lower Manhattan. It would have gone right through Greenwich Village. And it's a fight that went on for years, but Jane Jacobs was the local organizer and community voice that resisted Moses and all the power that the guy had. And in one battle after another, she managed to succeed. And Moses was never the same after that. But I also think of how in politics, the politics of the Vietnam War in the United States, when you had troop escalations and the draft, the response was hundreds of thousands of people in the street. Muhammad Ali's refusal to serve. I'm old enough to remember the 1968 Olympics when Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised the black power fist when they receive their medals. And then on into pop culture with music and TV and studios versus the bottom up sounds and images. Like you had The Sound of Music versus Bonnie and Clyde. You had Green Acres versus the Smothers Brothers. You had Doris Day and the swing era crooners versus Pink Floyd and the Rolling Stones. And all of this is, contextually makes what's happening today and what could grow much larger in the near future a lot more understandable.
Absolutely. It's almost like we've gotten a bit of a preview of it so far, of perhaps more dramatic things that we'll see to come when mood becomes more negative. I'm listening to you describe these stories from the 1960s and the 1970s. You had this dramatic change from a trend at large degree toward positive mood to a trend toward negative mood. And when that trend happened, the status quo was disrupted in so many different fields. You've listed some of them, whether you're talking about popular music, movies, entertainment, business, the ability of the grand titans of politics to continue their winning ways even, becomes up for grabs as well. A dramatic example of that is, of course, Richard Nixon, who was reelected in a landslide near the top of a rally in 1972 and then ended up resigning near the low in 1974. Dramatic change in social mood, dramatic change in political fortune and the fortunes of those in so many different fields. And Robert, just to circle back to this top-down versus bottom-up narrative, we can at least talk a little bit about maybe a variation on that theme, which is that sometimes, yes, you do see this rising up from below to challenge the status quo, but sometimes the status quo itself just can no longer hang together, and you see fracturing and alliances among elites. And this is something else to keep in mind when mood becomes more negative. One dramatic example of that is the American Revolution, where the leaders of that movement were wealthy guys, wealthy landowners, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and even someone like Alexander Hamilton, who came from more humble beginnings, to say the least, ended up marrying into a wealthy family. But you had these folks who had coexisted, at least had gotten along with the British crown, but after a 6-decade trend toward negative mood, toward the end of that move, that alliance could not hang together well. And so you got a revolution. Yeah,
and they were, all of the founding fathers were allies of the crown and benefited financially and in their social position, benefited greatly from that alliance. But when that wasn't true any longer, that's when they broke, and they succeeded.
That's right. And we've seen, again, in recent years, we've gotten a taste of this fracturing in alliances. We've seen it a little bit. We've seen it in Brexit, for example, where you have the fibers that connect the European Union starting to become frayed and in one case come unraveled. And this is just a preview for what we're likely to see at an even grander scale when social mood becomes more negative. Robert, during our conversation, I'm reminded of a story that I heard Malcolm Gladwell tell a number of years ago. He wrote a book called David-and-Goliath, and in his retelling, he sees Goliath as the underdog in that story. He's a giant, but he's kind of lumbering, he's slow, he probably can't see very well, he's got a bunch of armor, but his weaponry is only useful in close hand-to-hand combat, whereas you have this younger guy, David, who's agile, he's swift, he can move around, he's used to using his sling to defeat lions and bears who attacked his flock. He's a shepherd. My gosh, from a distance, he can take care of this Goliath character, no problem. And Gladwell's point is that giants in the social world are not necessarily as big and powerful as they may seem, and that sometimes those who appear to be at a disadvantage actually have hidden attributes or underappreciated attributes that can shift the odds in their favor. And when we think about social institutions, socioeconomically, usually Goliath does in fact have a tremendous amount of power, but that power hinges on a supportive social mood trend. And when that mood trend changes, the social Goliaths can become Gladwellian Goliaths and find that their power is no longer useful amid changing social conditions. So, Robert, I don't know if we think about, if we could fast forward maybe to a period where mood becomes more negative, are there particular areas of society that you have an eye on in terms of being candidates for some pretty significant social change?
Yes, and just to follow up on a couple of your thoughts, the turn in social mood is when people stop overestimating Goliath and they stop underestimating David, and they start to root for David or join whatever the bottom-up cause may be. And I think we definitely see early indications of movements that could grow when the trend turns decisively, in the near, not too distant future. For example, community efforts to reform police practices. Recently, the attempt to raise the minimum wage failed, but that fight hasn't gone away. You could see a resurgence of the labor movement, and the status quo is the corporations who are resisting a rise in the minimum wage don't want to see unions. But when the trend turns, socioeconomics is going to be a very useful context to put those rising trends within.
Absolutely, Robert. And just to conclude with some final thoughts here. I mean, we've talked about these David and Goliath struggles that we've seen throughout history. We talked about Bitcoin. We talked about GameStop. Looked back to the 1960s and 70s. But yeah, the real powerful part of this perspective is being forward-looking and thinking about the future. So whether we end up seeing more clashes between capital and labor, or we see more clashes between, say, the political status quo and voices that might currently be toward the fringes that make more inroads, or whether we simply see it in popular culture and entertainment in the rise of genres, say horror movies or punk-sounding music that may not be especially popular at the moment, but might have the wind at their back more so when that trend changes. It remains to be seen, but the point socioeconomically is that if you can anticipate these changes, then you can put yourself in a position to either capitalize on them or to get out of the way.
All right, get out of the way or get in front of them. When it comes to cultural creativity, it's easier now for the bottom up to participate than it's ever been. And there's no telling exactly what it's going to look like, but it's going to be a show.
Well, I look forward to seeing that show and trying to do our best to forecast some of those plot twists and developments along the way. By the way, we do that every month in the pages of The Socionomist. It's our monthly magazine. Whether you're interested in trends in pop culture, business, the economy, peace, war, disease, health, you name it. If it's a social trend, we've probably written at least one, probably more than one, studies about it. And you can get access to all of that information when you become a Socionomics Premier member. You can learn how to do that in the page below. Robert, thank you so much for taking some time to chat today. This has been a lot of fun. It's been a great conversation. Let's do it again sometime.
It's a pleasure. I do hope we get to do it again.